So, greetings from Global Tourism Forum, ladies and gentlemen, from Bodrum. As we all have known that the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the global tourism industry has carried well into 2021. With the new data by the Tourism Barometer has shown that world regions have continued to experience large drops in tourist arrivals in the first month of the year, with an 87% fall in international tourist arrivals in January as compared to 2020, resulting in a loss of almost 4.5 trillion to the industry. With 32% of all global destinations completely closed to tourist arrivals, international tourists have defaulted drastically. This would represent a loss of some in the range of 260 million international arrivals when compared to pre-pandemic levels. The availability and distribution of COVID-19 vaccine continues to be a major factor in the return to normalcy for many travelers, many countries. Although all countries are at a different level of recovery, many governments have taken impressive actions to cushion the blow to tourism, to minimize job losses, and to build recovery in 2021 and beyond. Of course, more needs to be done and in a more coordinated way. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I've got two very special guests who are at the forefront of their organizations trying to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. So joining me today is Kiran Afzal, Senior Private Sector Specialist, Finance and Competitiveness and Innovation for World Bank Group. And I've got Mr. Patrick L.Osewe, Chief of Health Sector Group, Asian Development Bank. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So without further ado, I will get started first, Kiran, with yourself, okay? The World Bank Group's Finance Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice, FCI, combines expertise in the financial sector with expertise in private sector development to foster private sector-led growth and help create markets in client countries. Through its work, World Bank's has had an evolving approach to development and financing to maximum leverage for private sector investments for sustainable and inclusive growth. Kiran, what does the World Bank support for the tourism industry in COVID-19 mean today, specifically in where you are seated at the moment?
Okay. Greetings, Sumaira. Allow me to begin by thanking you and by congratulating the World Tourism Forum Institute for holding the summit. So the World Bank has been at the forefront of doing kind of robust research on the impact of COVID-19 on the travel and tourism industry. We have a global portfolio whereby we are able to support our client countries in strengthening their tourism offering. And that includes a combination of technical assistance, our research, as I mentioned, and also our investment financing. So by way of that, we have been involved in providing advice to our client countries in terms of coping with the socioeconomic impact of COVID, broadly on the economy, and then specifically on the travel and tourism industries as well. So in addition to these publications and advisory work, what we also did was to sort of reconfigure our own ongoing activities in the tourism sector to mobilize resources for supporting the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the tourism and travel value chains to help absorb the shocks brought in by the COVID-19. And that, for example, in Pakistan includes provision of matching grants to these enterprises. And that also includes training on these standard operating procedures for COVID-19 times. And as we speak, some of these training are actually ongoing in the northwest of the country, which is quite big on tourism. It has been a combination of technical assistance, where we also provided advice on the government's own mitigation strategy for the travel and tourism sector. Because Sumaira, we believe that going forward, green, resilient, and inclusive development sector is going to be the key for imparting resilience to the micro, small, and medium enterprises, even in the tourism sector.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran, for that very concise answer. So, Patrick, how has ADB responded to this unprecedented health emergency across Asia and Pacific? Because your region specifically is at minus 96%, which continues to have the highest level of travel restrictions also in place recorded. It has recorded the largest decrease in international arrivals in January. Europe and Africa both saw a decline of 85% in arrivals, while the Middle East recorded a drop of 84%. So when you compare that, Americas was 77%, and Asia Pacific has been minus 96%. So share with us with some of the insights.
So so in the Asian region, in the last 20 years, we've had basically three big pandemics. In 2003, we had the SARS pandemic, and 2009 H1N1 pandemic, and in 2012 and 2015 we had the MERS pandemic. It was not so big because it was mostly East Asia. And so we always expected that within 5 or 7 years, we'd have yet another pandemic. But this one took us by surprise because of the scale and the magnitude. And it moved very fast from Asia into Europe and then into the Americas. And so as a development bank, the second largest in the world and the largest in Asia, and given that our region is very much dependent on tourism, we took 3 steps to try and address this issue. So 3 approaches. First was to do a lot of analytical work and also to generate a lot of knowledge to be able to share the experience of how to deal with COVID, because this was a new disease. It had never been described before, and nobody knew how to deal with it. So we brought various experts from around the world to address how we can, how countries can implement the various interventions, including those that affected the tourism sector. The second thing that we did was to convene, because this was just too big for one organization to deal with. So we worked very closely with the World Bank, with various other organizations to see how collectively we could support developing member countries to deal with this problem. And then the third one was financing. Provided significant resources, $20 billion initially, to support countries, basically a stimulus package to look at various facets of the economy to ensure that the countries were stabilized, unemployment was being addressed, and also social protection for the vulnerable population. So we did a lot of work in that regard, specifically for tourism, given the demand for knowledge in our region. We brought in some of the leading experts in tourism and brought together partners from the International Civil Aviation Organization, from IATA, from travel industry, from hotels, from aircraft manufacturers, to basically look at what would it take from a customer's journey from their home through the airport, into the aircraft, and back to the airport, and back to home or a hotel. Where are some of the areas where there are risks for people to get infected, and is traveling a risk? And the consensus from these experts that the risk of travel is not beyond any risk in society. In fact, most of them recommended that travel is actually safer than sometimes in society. So we generated a lot of knowledge that we shared across with our developing member countries.
Thank you, Patrick. So back to World Bank, Kiran. The group's focuses on 6 thematic areas: financial stability and integrity, financial inclusion, infrastructure and access, firm capabilities and innovation, long-term finance, and climate and risk management. Could you elaborate on the beneficiaries of World Bank's projects to rebuild the tourism supplied value chain in the pandemic era? How has your engagement been with your specific government that you are working up close and personal with?
Okay, thank you, Sumaira. So in terms of direct beneficiaries of our investment project financing, we have the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are spread across the travel and tourism value chains. And they are being accessed to our projects through financial inclusion measures. I mentioned mentor grants, training support, and also technical advice in terms of business support services to help them get ready and get the destinations ready for post-COVID times when the tourists will start returning. The other group of beneficiaries, of course, include our public sector clients, which are the national and subnational governments, and we are engaging with them through technical assistance and also by way of our projects. And in addition to that, whatever publications are being produced, they are being disseminated widely to a broader group of stakeholders like academia, policymakers, and also the big corporates in the private sector like hoteliers, restaurant owners, and so on.
Okay. So Kiran, just I want to delve a little bit more here that, okay, when you were saying that the private sector can apply for these grants directly with the bank, or what's the process behind this?
So yeah, that's a good question. And basically, the beneficiaries for the grants, our financial support, are accessed not directly. They don't access the bank directly, but they are able to apply to the project because our projects are implemented by the clients, and we have project implementation units which have their own governance mechanism for filtering the applications and processing the applications for these grants. So as World Bank, we provide implementation support, and we help strengthen the fiduciary arrangements for processing and awarding of these grants.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, coming to yourself, there have been some positive developments with regard to global vaccine rollout. I want to really, really deep dive with you on this because I know you've really been, as head of the healthcare sector, you've been at the forefront of it. A handful of countries have seen vaccine distribution is accelerating and putting them on track to reach herd immunity before previously anticipated. On the other hand, the outlook for certain countries is not so optimistic. For example, in India, with the current surge in COVID infections causing healthcare systems almost to buckle and slowing the distribution, and other countries can actually learn from this. So talk to us about this, and where do you think you can make your bank is making the difference to even out the playing field?
So, Sumaira, the development of the COVID vaccine is unprecedented. From the time that the genome was published online to the time that the first vaccine was approved was 326 days. This is historical because the shortest vaccine ever in history to be developed was 4 years. The average is actually 7 to 10 years. So this is really unprecedented. And so several vaccines have now been developed that are in the market. The challenge, of course, is the shortage of vaccines. There are some parts of the world that have a significant amount of vaccines. In Asia and the Pacific, we are still struggling. Many of our developing member countries do not have sufficient numbers. And some countries have big populations, like, for example, Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, and so on. And so there's a significant demand. All countries would like to ensure that up to 70% of their populations are vaccinated. And because of that, there's several options that are being considered. First is to support manufacturing as much as possible, provide financing for manufacturing companies to have partners in Asia that can produce more vaccines to be able to meet the demand in 2021. But 2021 we will not vaccinate most people in 2021. I think the most vaccination will be in 2022. Now, if in the tourism industry, there's been a lot of discussion regarding how do we protect the industry, with some people saying that perhaps only people who are vaccinated should be able to travel. But in our region, that is still problematic because in many countries other than the small island states like Maldives, Bhutan, and some of the Pacific Island nations where more than 50% of the people have been vaccinated. For most countries, it's still less than 10%. And in some countries,
I read that stat somewhere.
Yes, exactly. And some countries less than 5%. So you cannot require people to have a vaccine to be able to travel. That would be a discriminatory approach to traveling. So this is still a big issue. The challenges in India, because India is the largest manufacturer of vaccines worldwide. Before COVID, every sixth child in the world got a vaccine from India. But because the crisis in India has been so serious, the government prioritized the vaccines for the Indian population. That put a lot of strain on the number of vaccines that were available for developing countries in Asia and also in Africa. But we are working with the Indian government to see how some of this can be resolved. We are also working with other governments to see if we can support manufacturing from other sources other than India. But manufacturing is not instant. It's something that takes a while. Technology transfer takes at a minimum 6 months. And so the outlook in 2021 is not very optimistic. I think that the majority of the world population will be vaccinated towards the end of 2021 and 2022.
Right. Those are staggering numbers that you are quoting there, Patrick. I mean, it's a real eye-opener, right? Because to hear that, okay, India is the world's largest manufacturer of vaccines, and you forget that after witnessing the mayhem that we have just recently seen, and the fact that it is going to put additional pressure on the entire food chain of vaccine distribution overall. So thank you for sharing those insights. But then that means it puts additional pressure on tourism as well. So it's a real paradox here, that how do you overcome this situation and scenario? So
we are working closely. So we are working closely with the World Bank because the World Bank provided $12 billion for vaccines, and the ADB $9 billion for vaccines, and the Inter-American Development Bank between the three to. They don't have a specific figure, but the countries that are requiring financing to support vaccines, they're providing financing. And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is also providing co-financing with the World Bank and also with ADB. So there's significant resources to support developing member countries to obtain vaccines to be able to vaccinate their people. The shortage, of course, is the biggest bottleneck, but that will be resolved over time.
Right. And do you think the patents and the generic manufacturing of the vaccine is an answer?
So not a discussion in that regard. The World Trade Organization organized a meeting about a month ago that brought together manufacturing companies, developing member countries, and India and South Africa are leading an effort to allow developing member countries to be able to produce vaccines. And so there's a lot of conversation going on. There's a lot of support from the developed world as well, but the consensus has not been reached. But I think that will be a big step in terms of making vaccines available.
Thank you. Kiran, do you want to say something here?
Yes, thank you, Patrick, for a very informative overview of the vaccine rollouts and the support that the development partners are providing. So I think, Sumaira, going back to your point that, this all has an impact on the tourism sector, because we all have a consensus that the first segment of tourism, which we see already recovering, is the domestic tourism. And we already see that the authorities here in Pakistan, for example, and I think globally also, are requesting one of the two things: either that the tourists carry with themselves a negative PCR test report, or they carry a vaccination certificate in order to be able to get hotel bookings. So this comes into force in Pakistan as of today. for people who are 50 plus, and for those who are 30 plus, this comes into force July 1st. So I think the sooner the vaccine coverage becomes wider and available, the quicker the sector is going to be able to recover. And there, the stakeholders, the private sector and the travelers, they will feel more confident about resuming the travel businesses.
So, but I just recently conducted an interview with some EU officials, and besides the various supports for the tourism industry, there's a lot of discussions going on, and especially in the EU, on the vaccine passports to allow for travel during the COVID-19 pandemic. So my question to both of you is that do you think this is a good idea, or is this, because I have spoken to a few other the industry stakeholders, like some major large tour operator groups, world groups, I don't want to take their names, who think not, because they think it's just going to overcomplicate already a complicated situation. So my question to both of you is, do you think the vaccine passport is an answer? Patrick, with yourself.
Yeah, I think it depends. If you look back for yellow fever, for example, for years, whenever people travel, there was that yellow card that people used, and that was recognized by national governments, but also recognized by airlines. But this was being organized and recommended by the World Health Organization, and therefore it was a card that everybody knew about. Now, when we come to vaccines, it's still a big challenge, because there isn't one passport that everybody recognizes that this is a passport that if you have it, you have the vaccine. But there's still no consensus to do that, because not many people have been vaccinated. So until such a time that the majority of the world have been vaccinated and there's herd immunity, it's very difficult to reach a consensus on this issue. So at country level, perhaps it could work. Like, for instance, in a country like the US, whereby by July 4th, 70% of the population will have gotten at least one vaccine, you could apply something like that. But, or say if it's Maldives, where 80% of the population has been vaccinated, you could apply something like that. But how would you apply a passport in Japan where only 3% of the population have been vaccinated? It's not possible. So I think that right now it's still a theoretical construct, but maybe in future it's something that there could be a consensus that brings together nations and business to say that this is a recognized passport.
Okay, Kiran, your view?
Yes, so I think again, I have to sort of build on what Patrick just said. So what's happening is that a lot of countries are playing this by ear, as you can see, because, this links directly to countries' efforts to bring governance around the concept of managing the tourist and travelers inflow, both inbound and outbound. So they need to have some kind of mechanism to ensure that their own population is protected, because this is something which is contagious, and that is leading to a lot of health concerns and associated expenses and burden on the health system. So I think countries, in all fairness, are trying their best to make sure that they support the tourism industry and the travel industry, and they also not let this impact their own population and become and it leads to a situation which is unfortunate and which adds burden to the health systems. And I think this also links to the destination's own preparedness in terms of how much upgrade they want to do in providing confidence to the travelers and high paying segment of tourists that it's safe for them to enter a certain country or to stay in a certain country. But I think it will be quite random initially, and it will depend on what kind of acceptability there is for certain brands of vaccination or for certain kinds of passport. I don't see a big consensus happening around this very soon.
That's
And without a consensus, there's potentially you could get fake passports. Because how do you know which is a genuine passport? What system do you have in place to know which is genuine and what is not genuine? Well, if there's consensus with a good global platform, you can easily just check to say that, okay, so and so has been vaccinated in this country, and this is a legitimate vaccine.
That's interesting insights. That's interesting to hear that, because I think you guys must be following more than me that how it is being announced and drum rolled in the EU. You know, this whole concept. Yes, so it's like Kiran said, it's the point of governance, right? To have this global governance system that can cover everybody, but also what is very interesting for me is Patrick, the what you said, that Japan is at 3%. So no more we are at this thing about the divide is not between developing countries and developed countries only, because Japan is a well-developed country and 3% only rollout. And that makes us in Pakistan maybe a little bit proud, or any other country, that they've done better than Japan. So it's a very uneven playing field, and nobody really quite know what the rules of the games are, and they can change at the shortest of incidents and pretexts. Where today it's India, it could be some other country, preparing themselves for the third wave. We don't know the third wave that everybody, it's come already in certain countries and it's coming. It could just completely change the picture as we speak. So,
but this is what we saw, Sumaira. This is what we also saw in the Pacific, whereby New Zealand and Australia had controlled COVID, and they were planning a travel bubble between Australia and New Zealand. And we are also discussing whether some of the Pacific Island nations like Fiji should also be part of that bubble. And the date was set for the travel to start, and then there was a problem in the state of Victoria, whereby now there was significant transmission and everything was cancelled.
Yeah, right.
And then, of course,
during our last town hall, and we talked about it,
Yes, exactly. And then in India, things were going on so well that we all thought that the pandemic was waning, and then all of a sudden there was this big crisis that then has affected the entire region because there's a lot of traveling with a lot of movement within the region. So it's very unpredictable what's going to happen.
Yeah. So my final and the last question to both of you, I can just keep on talking to both of you. I'm finding it so interesting, because your organizations are truly at the forefront, so you've got a good pulse of what's going on. So but my final question, because of lack of time, is so what is your advice to the tourism actors or the players, with the stakeholders, that to be confident of what in the next tourism circle of life or cycle is going to look like? Kiran, with yourself, perhaps.
Okay, so we are headed for both interesting and challenging times for all the segments of the economy. And this particularly is true for the travel and tourism sector, because I think rightly there's been a saying that this was the first sector to get impacted so severely. And this is probably going to be one of the last ones which shows full recovery once this pandemic gets under control. So there are, 2 or 3 specific measures which need to be in place. First of all, the government and the private sector will have to work together very closely, because there's so much information flow now, and it's changing overnight about the spread of pandemic, about the vaccination rollout, about the international travel requirements, that the government will have to start passing on that information almost in real time to the private sector stakeholders which are operating within that particular country. And for that, they will have to use digital platforms, and they are already doing so. I've seen this happening in Pakistan. So, and in a few other places around the world. Number 2, the private sector will have to accept the SOPs in a true letter and spirit, which are being announced by the governments globally. And they will need a lot of training, hand holding, and assurances from the government, in some cases financial support also, to make sure that they are ready to implement those hygiene and health standards to provide the confidence to the travelers. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a question of a governance also, that how strict is the implementation at the ground level, what kind of checks and balances are in place. And then the destinations will have to be ready to provide better facilities and a better environment for the tourist. And I think this is a great opportunity and a blessing in disguise for the authorities and private sector to revamp their tourism offering, to integrate more environmental standards, to rebuild much better, and to ensure that the sector is green and resilient. So these are 2 or 3 measures. And then, of course, regional collaboration. We have to learn from countries which have successfully introduced tourism bubbles, which have certain measures in place that have helped their domestic tourism and subsequently international tourism recover. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Patrick.
Yes, there are 4 things. First is every country should know their pandemic. What does that mean? In many countries, the spread of infection is not uniform across the country. Sometimes it's in one city or sometimes in one region. And therefore, it's important that countries continue to invest in testing to be able to know where is the majority of spread taking place. Because you could have a situation where
you are saying their own
they should know. They should know.
Ecosystem.
They should know. Yes, they should know where the pandemic is spreading. So, for example, Pakistan is a big country. It could be spreading only in one province in Pakistan, and other provinces are safe, right? This is what we found out in India. It was only spreading mostly in 10 out of 36 states and territories. And so it's important that testing continues to be prioritized, and there's investment to be able to know where the spread is taking place, because we still have tourism in another part of the country, because people, and so the tourists also want to know what is the magnitude of the problem in the destination country, because if they don't know, then they're afraid to go to a particular country. The second thing is making vaccines available and also prioritizing the tourism sector, because these are people that are meeting people from outside the country or people from another part of the country. And therefore, as you vaccinate, as countries prioritize their risk groups, and the people that should get vaccines first should be also people who work in the tourism industry, people who work in hotels and so on. And third is that people should not let their guard down. I think that this is the biggest challenge. That's when people look at the positivity rate and they're seeing that the epidemic, the spread is slowing down, people let their guard down and then they get infected. I think this is for general society, but at the same time for the tourism sector. And then lastly, looking at the medium to long term, us at ADB, the tourism sector is going to be part and parcel as we prepare for future pandemics and countries developing their preparedness plans. I think that the tourism is going to be a major part of those plans. In the past, they were not, but I think that going forward. And so we are seeing, like, for example, in the Philippines, we are providing financing as they build their tourism infrastructure. They are also building the health facilities in those areas and making sure that the testing is available, and also looking at options of having human resources working in those areas, so that if a tourist, for example, were to fall sick, there are ways of taking care of them, and also there are ways by which they could be supported before they go, say, for evacuation, or they go to the capital city for further care.
Okay, so thank you. Those are really interesting points that each one of you have made. But so I think what I'm capturing from Kiran's points is that how the governments communicate with the private sector. That's very, very important, and how the private sector takes it on board. That engagement is very important. So so somebody has to facilitate that engagement and that talk, and I think that's the role the bank is playing very effectively. And Patrick, I'm always fascinated listening to you and your insights, because you've got I know you've got that dashboard in front of you, that how that rollout is happening and who's got less or more. But one of the things which I think is very important also is that our Secretary General, Dr. Talib Rifai, has made, and he's really talking about it a lot, is that communication, intergovernmental communication, government to government, that's very critical, how they are engaging, and how whilst it's everybody's own problem in their backyard, and everybody's I like that term that you use, that know your own pandemic, and how your own COVID looks like, but at the same time, talking to your neighbors, talking to the other governments, that communication is very important, and there has been a certain breakdown in that over the past 6-8 months, because people the governments have started looking inwardly more and more, because addressing their own problems, and because everybody is for themselves right now, so to speak. Hopefully we can put the third or the fourth wave behind, and this herd immunity starts taking shape and place, so that everybody starts seeing it, that it's everybody's problem. And I think, again, your organizations, both of the banks, Asian Development Bank and World Bank, has been at the forefront of conveying that messaging. So thank you very much. We've been just exactly on time. I'm very impressed by both my speakers. And I'll continue to talk to you individually as well, if you feel that we need to talk more, because we are always at World Tourism Forum Institute would welcome you both back again to highlight this topic again and touch upon it. Thank you very much for your time.